or good morning, depending on where you are in the world. Thank you for joining us. We just took our first break, and my apologies, we're running a little behind time, and I certainly will try to ensure that we don't lose any more, but certainly the presentations so far have been excellent, engaging, thought-provoking, and certainly we expect that the presentations will only get better. I'd like to introduce our next speaker. Our next speaker, who I'm about to invite, is Francisca Pretorius. She is a lawyer and academic and political advisor with a strong commitment to justice reform. She is currently the advisor and head of the Office of Civil and Criminal Justice Reform at the Commonwealth Secretariat. The office's mission is to transform the operation of justice systems and the delivery of justice across the Commonwealth by creating impactful and user-centered legal knowledge products, networks, and platforms so that equal justice for all is ensured. Her past experience includes working as senior associate at corporate law firms in both South Africa and the United States, appearances in the Supreme Court and Constitutional Court of South Africa, teaching at Harvard University in the United States of America, Strathmore University in Kenya, and University of Stellenbosch in South Africa, and working with governors and legislators in the United States on clean energy policy. She holds an LLB and a master's in law, in international trade law, and an MBA. I invite Ms. Pretorius to make a presentation to us on the very important Commonwealth Anticorruption benchmarks. Francisca, over to you. I invite you to take the floor. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I just want to confirm, can you see my screen, which says the Commonwealth Anti-Corruption benchmarks? And can you hear me properly?
We are seeing your screen. Thank you. Excellent. And we're hearing properly. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you again. And it's an honor to present the Commonwealth Anti-Corruption benchmarks to you all today. The Commonwealth Anti-Corruption Benchmarks is a brand new publication and a corruption fighting tool. And, you know, this is one of the tools in the toolkit or in our Swiss Army knife that our previous speaker might have spoken about. And it was published in April 2021. It is a landmark publication of the Commonwealth Secretariat, produced in partnership with the Global Infrastructure Anti-Corruption Centre and the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors. In brief, the benchmarks contain good practice anti-corruption measures. They're intended primarily to help governments and public sector organizations assess their anti-corruption laws, regulations, policies, and procedures against international good practice and consider implementing appropriate improvements. The benchmarks measures are designed to be achievable, practical, and auditable. They provide a holistic and interlocking system that aims to reduce and deal with the risk of corruption in the public and private sectors. The benchmarks address corruption across key areas of both public and private sectors, which are either important for combating corruption or which are vulnerable to significant corruption. In relation to each key area, the benchmarks promote the concepts of honesty, impartiality, accountability, and transparency, and provide for specific anti-corruption measures. I would like to give you some background information on how the benchmarks came about. And it all started in May 2016 when the Secretariat convened the Tackling Corruption Together conference. At this conference, global leaders from civil society, business, and government who are championing the fight against corruption gathered to set out their commitments to prevent corruption in an effort to bolster good governance and transparency and support sustainable development. Then after this conference, the Secretariat decided to analyze the use and role of standards within Commonwealth countries to support anti-corruption efforts. The conference and research suggested a need for a resource, so the Secretariat engaged experts to assist with drafting. So in 2018, a draft of the benchmarks was presented to senior officials of law ministries at their annual meeting, and here the officials welcomed the development of the anti-corruption benchmarks and also welcomed our approach of benchmarks, requesting the Secretariat to proceed with a consultation process with all member countries, really in order to ensure that the benchmarks were country-owned. In accordance with these directions, the Secretariat invited representatives of Commonwealth law ministries, Commonwealth anti-corruption agencies, Commonwealth partner organizations, multilateral development banks, international organizations, academic specialists, and technical experts to a meeting of a consultation group to review the anti-corruption benchmarks in 2019. This consultation group provided continued assistance by reviewing drafts for the remainder of the process. So in November 2019, a draft was presented to our law ministers, and a few months later, the experts finalized this. This year, we were proud to publish and launch the 524-page Commonwealth Anti-Corruption Benchmarks. So who was this drafted for, and who can benefit from these benchmarks? Well, first and foremost, a government can assess whether its current laws, regulations, policies, and procedures are consistent with the measures recommended in the benchmarks. If they are not, the relevant government can consider upgrading them so that they meet or exceed the benchmark standard. Similarly, a public sector body can review the sections of the benchmarks which are relevant to its activities and can measure and upgrade its policies and procedures accordingly. The contents of the benchmarks have been written in a clear and measurable manner so as to facilitate such review and implementation. The benchmarks have been written with sufficient clarity, detail, and supporting guidance that members of the public and NGOs can also measure existing laws, regulations, and public sector policies and procedures against the benchmarks, and they can call for consequent improvements. They thus facilitate the process of holding the government and the public sector to account against international good practice. So you may ask, are the benchmarks also relevant to private sector? From an implementation perspective, the benchmarks are primarily applicable to government and the public sector. However, they also affect the private sector, as most of the recommended actions in the benchmarks for government and public sector bodies will impact the private sector. Some of the benchmarks apply equally to public and private sectors. For example, Annex A to the guidance provides a simple and clear anti-corruption program, which is recommended as a minimum standard for private sector organizations to comply with if they enter into public sector contracts over a reasonable value threshold. What are the sources of the benchmarks? They are largely based on key published and recognized national and international sources. These are referenced in the guidance section. These sources are wide-ranging and include, for example, the UNODC, other UN agencies, the IMF, the OECD, WTO, UNCITRAL, the European Union, the Jakarta Statement on Principles for Anti-Corruption Agencies, Commonwealth partner organizations, the OSCE, the International Standards Organization, and the International Chamber of Commerce. So as to ensure that the benchmarks are easily usable, the benchmarks only summarize key aspects of these sources and do not attempt to replicate these sources in full. In cases where there may be no recognized international good practice, the benchmarks propose a good practice measure, and the benchmarks therefore provide a core set of measures consistent with, but often expanding upon, existing international standards. A website that you can download the benchmarks from is displayed on the slide. It's very easy to find the benchmarks, even if you don't have this link. If you Google Commonwealth Anti-Corruption Benchmarks, you'll find them. They are free to access and download. I also want to let you know that there are frequently asked questions and other material available on the benchmarks. So what's the structure of the benchmarks? Well, we have 25 benchmarks, and each benchmark is accompanied by detailed guidance to assist audit and implementation. So they've been developed and grouped in 5 areas. The first area is law, regulation, and enforcement. That's benchmarks 1 to 9. You'll see benchmark 1 is corruption offences, sanctions, and remedies. 4, for example, is the court system. 5 is parliament. 9, political lobbying, financing, spending, and elections. Then the second one is public sector control. That's benchmark 10 to 21. So public sector organizations, for example, contract management, concession management, and so on. Then the third group is setting standards at benchmark 22 and 23. The fourth group is participation of society. That's benchmark 24. And the fifth group is international cooperation, benchmark 25. For ease of use and so as to avoid unnecessary repetition or duplication between all the anti-corruption measures, the 25 benchmarks have been structured on a modular basis. The modules, where necessary, cross-refer to each other, and the intention here is that each benchmark should be read with the guidance to that benchmark. The guidance section provides for each benchmark a brief explanation of the purpose of the benchmark, explanation of various provisions in each benchmark, and references to published good practice. And I want to emphasize, when fully implemented, the benchmarks are designed to create an interlocking prevention system that aims to reduce the risk of corruption at all key touchpoints. So what's next for the benchmarks? Well, as I said, we published them, we launched them, and now we are drafting an implementation roadmap and a detailed audit for anti-corruption agencies as a guide to use these benchmarks. As I said, our benchmarks, it's quite a big piece of work, 524 pages, and we wanted to provide a step-by-step guidance on how to conduct audits, how to implement improvements, and how to continue monitoring throughout this process. And we're very excited to make this available to you all in the next few months. Then our aim was to receive endorsement from heads of government at the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting that was supposed to be held in June of this year. Unfortunately, due to COVID, it has been postponed for a second time. We will, however, seek endorsement at the next meeting of heads of government. Then we are also continuing to engage with Commonwealth member countries who are willing to implement this. And as I mentioned, we had a launch, and I just also wanted to say there that we recorded this launch, and we invite you to take a look at and listen to the recording on our website. Thank you again for your time and interest in the anti-corruption benchmarks. Feel free to email me at that email address. OCCJR stands for the Office of Civil and Criminal Justice Reform at commonwealth.int. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Francisca. Thank you.
Are there any questions from you?
Are there any questions? Yes. There appear to be none at this stage. Thank you for the excellent presentation. And coming on the heels of the April 2021 launch, we thank you at such short notice sharing with us, obviously, this other very progressive step that certainly can be utilized hand in hand with UNCAC and the other conventions that exist. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you.